In Iten-Chibai-Bashajo, the French Revolution broke out, overthrowing the feudal system. The revolutionary situation was looking great at first. However, not long after, a group of radical figures led by Robespierre formed the Jacobins and used mobs to control the French government, seizing the fruits of the revolution. In just 1 year from Iten-Chibai-Joseon, they executed King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, and under charges of counter-gen revolutionary activities, brutally persecuted dissenters, executing over 6,000 people, with an average of more than 100 heads chopped off every day on the guillotine. In Iten-Chibai-Joseon, opposition politicians finally couldn't take it anymore and launched the Thermidorian coup, toppling the Jacobins amidst cheers from the crowd. However, the new government established by the Thermidorians, lacking political experience, wasn't much better either. The people of Paris then successively staged the Fructidor Uprising and Vendemiaire Uprising to oppose the Thermidorian regime. Thus, in Iten-Chibai-Joseon, the National Convention, controlled by the Thermidorians, had no choice but to promulgate a new constitution and establish another new government, led by 5 directors, hence known as the Directory. France's new regime was maintained under this extremely unstable state. Why was it barely holding on? Because besides facing domestic pressures, there were also external pressures from abroad. You see, those countries surrounding France were still feudal states at that time. When France suddenly had a revolution and overthrew its feudal system, cutting off the king's head, how could these kings not be afraid? So to prevent their own people from being affected and starting a revolution too, they united to form an anti-Gen French alliance, challenging the new French regime in attempts to restore the feudal monarchy. Therefore, at this time, France's primary task was to fight against the anti-Gen French coalition and safeguard the fruits of the revolution, who had military talent and performed well in battles against the anti-Gen French coalition, would naturally become a national hero in the eyes of the French people. We often say that standing on Funkoshan, the windward side, even pigs can fly. This is a typical example of such a situation, so Napoleon, who happened to have military talent, took off. Seizing this opportunity, he actively showcased his bravery and prowess in battle, rising from a mere artillery officer all the way up to general status, achieving significant military victories in Italy and becoming a national hero in the hearts of the French people. But actually, Napoleon originally didn't want to be French at all. Born in Iten-Chibai-Bashajo in Ajaccio on Corsica, which was independent from France back then, he even actively promoted Corsican independence. However, after becoming a national hero among the French people in Iten-Chibai-Bashajo, his self-gen identity instantly changed from "I am Corsican" to "I am French," no longer mentioning anything about Corsican independence anymore. So looking at this Schreidinger's Frenchman, we can see that only drugged-up citizens have patriotic feelings. Politicians actually only care about personal ambition and aspirations. Earlier we mentioned that the French regime was then in the hands of a directory, led by 5 directors. But this government wasn't very popular, so they were quite alert to Napoleon's rising reputation and became wary of him. Cunning Napoleon saw the writing on the wall and immediately left Paris for Egypt. His expedition to Egypt was partly to follow in Alexander the Great's footsteps and partly to weaken British influence in the eastern Mediterranean as a stepping stone towards India, accumulating more political capital. However, on August RND Iten-Chibai-Bashajo, French naval forces were thoroughly defeated by Britain, shattering Napoleon's dreams of invading India. Yet his failure in Egypt didn't dent his popularity. The French still admired him for being a man of action. At this point, the anti-Gen French coalition was regrouping again, and France urgently needed a capable national hero to save it from peril. The cunning Napoleon wouldn't miss such an opportunity. He left behind the mess in Egypt and returned to France, joining a conspiracy group planning a coup. On November Iten-Chibai-Bashajo, he successfully seized power from the Directory, which was known as the coup of Brumaire. After the coup's success, Napoleon became one of 3 consuls, but soon enough, under his strong leadership, he took control of this new regime and in Iten-Chibai-Bashajo, couldn't wait to amend the constitution to become a lifetime consul. On November Lutheh Mbabailin C, he even went further by declaring himself emperor, restoring feudal titles. By now, many people might wonder Napoleon's path towards dictatorship was too smooth, wasn't it? Look at other dictators around the world. They all have to be very cautious when amending constitutions and extending their terms of office. Right, so how could Napoleon do things so smoothly and easily steal the fruits of the revolution? How did French people who shed countless blood for the revolution willingly hand over power to him? The answer is actually quite simple. The easiest way to make people willingly give up power is by exploiting nationalism. Therefore, dictators love to engage in aggressive foreign policies, being tough externally and deliberately provoking conflicts everywhere to create enemies. Because the worse the international environment, the more united the internal populace will be. When everyone unites against external threats, don't I then have a convenient way of gathering them around me for centralization? And Napoleon didn't even need to intentionally provoke such aggressive diplomacy, because at that time, the international situation was perfect. Britain, Holland, Spain, Prussia, and even the Ottomans and Russia in the east were all against France. Everywhere you looked, there were enemies of France. France was at its most dangerous moment, while Napoleon happened to be a military genius, so he didn't need to do anything just by rallying people with his call. The anti-Jan French coalition's desire to destroy him would only strengthen. Then he could unite the French people around him. So, Napoleon is a typical example of history-making heroes. It is not that he used his talent to change history, but rather that history needed his talent at that moment. Therefore, those who lack both talent and adaptability to their era can just dream about becoming Napoleons. After successfully crowning himself emperor, Napoleon utilized the centralized bureaucratic system, holding all power in his hands, and began ruling France with an iron fist. For a time, the democratic representative institutions that the French people had established through one revolution after another with great difficulty all became mere decorations. The legislature was reduced to an institution serving the emperor. Local governments existed in name only. Yet France truly needed Napoleon at that time. Why just think about the countries in the anti-Jan French coalitions? What kind of states were they? Feudal states, right. The reason they opposed France was precisely because France had suddenly staged a revolution and overthrown the feudal system. So their aim in opposing France was to preserve feudalism. In that case, wasn't Napoleon's struggle against the coalitions essentially a struggle against feudalism? Wasn't he objectively defending the achievements of the French Revolution? So you see, dictators all want to be Napoleon, but not just anyone can be Napoleon. Any dictator can amend the constitution and strangle the fruits of democracy, but very few can, like Napoleon, time their dictatorship so perfectly that it even played a positive historical role. That is also why so many people hold him in high regard, even worship him as a national hero. Moreover, Napoleon's abilities were genuinely real, not manufactured by power. Napoleon came from a minor noble family, received a good education from an early age, graduated with distinction from a regular military academy, and his military talents were beyond reproach. Nothing like those slackers who couldn't get into art school and so took up soldiering as a toady. Napoleon was also deeply influenced by Enlightenment thought, well versed in both natural sciences and the humanities and history, with virtually no cultural weak spots. When he invaded Egypt, he even took along a large contingent of scholars, conducting archaeology while fighting. The results of these studies were later compiled into the famous description de l'Egypte, which became a foundational work of modern Egyptology. Napoleon also presided over the drafting of the famous Napoleonic Code, which, based on Roman law, had a profound impact on the civil law of many contemporary nations. Not only that, Napoleon possessed many fine qualities. He promoted talent based on merit rather than birth, and he was genuinely devoted to Empress Josephine. One could say that aside from his desires and ambitions, he was almost a paragon of virtue. Of course, like any dictator, Napoleon was constantly afraid of losing his seat, so he imposed strict censorship, indoctrinated students with mindless patriotism and loyalty to the emperor, and had the vanity common to most people, using power to burnish his image. Yet even so, Napoleon, who had real substance, was incomparable to mere schoolboys. He had genuinely won victory after victory for France. In Item Babailin Wu, Napoleon personally led his army eastward, crushing the Third Coalition composed of Austria, Britain, and Russia, forcing the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that had lasted over Baba years, to completely dissolve. The following year, he defeated the Fourth Coalition of Britain, Russia, and Prussia, swallowing up most of Germany. In June 10 the French army routed the Russians in Poland, and Tsar Alexander I was forced to sign the Treaty of Tilsit, allying with France. In 10 Napoleon intervened in the Spanish royal succession dispute. The Spanish people, unwilling to be ruled by France, rose in resistance but were brutally massacred by the French army. Ultimately, with his hands stained in Spanish blood, Napoleon installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. At this point, Napoleon's dominance in Europe reached its peak except for Britain. Still fidgeting across the sea, the entire European continent had basically knelt. If a man wins one battle, you could say it is luck. But with a record as brilliant as Napoleon's, that was definitely not something an ordinary person could achieve merely with national strength and extraordinary luck. However, just as Napoleon's idol Alexander the Great finally stumbled in India, Napoleon eventually stumbled because he had gone too far. In Iba, as tensions with Russia intensified, Napoleon led a grand army of Wu-Tei-Ni-Ning-Tei-Nei-Mien in a massive campaign towards Moscow. Yet even after the French army captured Moscow at great cost, Tsar Alexander I still refused to compromise. But by then, the French army was already at the end of its tether deep in enemy territory, lacking reinforcements and facing the brutal Russian winter. With no choice, Napoleon ordered a retreat, having achieved no military objective and lost by Fujiyosha of his forces. Those who enjoy watching nature documentaries will surely know that a hegemony established through violence cannot afford to lose. A mighty lion rules the pride by violence, suppressing rivals, but once injured and its fighting power wanes, its hegemony is hard to sustain. Thus Napoleon's hegemony, built on military victories, was also unable to withstand defeat. After suffering enormous losses in Russia, the Sixth Coalition, composed of Britain, Russia, Prussia and Austria, struck back in Iba Sen. This time, Napoleon's invincible myth was finally shattered. In the midst of betrayal and desertion, the French army suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Leipzig. On Senshi March Iba the Allied forces, having completely defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Laon, entered Paris. Napoleon was forced to surrender, abdicate, and was exiled to a remote island in the Mediterranean. Napoleon probably never imagined that his own restoration of the feudal imperial system would ultimately benefit the French Bourbon dynasty, the very dynasty that the revolution had originally overthrown. In Iba, after Napoleon was exiled, Louis XVIII, the brother of King Louis XVI, who had fled abroad during the revolution, returned to Paris with the support of the anti-Zen French coalition and successfully restored the monarchy. Of course, French people who were high on nationalism must have been quite unhappy with this king supported by foreign forces. So on March Yiba, with the support of the people, Napoleon came back again to drive out Louis XVIII and take control of France once more. However, this time Napoleon's rule only lasted for over 100 days before being toppled by the anti-Zen French coalition again. On June in Waterloo, south of Brussels, Belgium, the anti-Zen French coalition utterly defeated Napoleon's French army. From then on, Waterloo unfortunately became synonymous with utter defeat. The Allied forces quickly occupied Paris and Napoleon had to abdicate once more, being exiled to St. Helena, an even more remote island in the Atlantic Ocean. And this time he never managed to rise again. 6 years later he passed away alone. After Napoleon's exile, Louis XIII returned to France for a second time with the support of the Allied forces. In fact, it turned out that Louis XIII was a wise monarch, whose rule essentially followed constitutional monarchy and policies centered on economic development. Under his reign, France gradually recovered its former prosperity, and French people lived better lives. As such, those who once enthusiastically supported Napoleon completely put aside their nationalism and embraced this king supported by foreign forces. Although the Bourbon dynasty and constitutional monarchy were not ultimately the choice of the French people, we can still feel that the final choice of the people must be one that brings peace and prosperity to them. Even though under certain specific historical conditions, the people might be manipulated by ambitious politicians or driven by nationalist sentiments to elevate some anti-Gen historical trend politicians to a pedestal, it is ultimately just a temporary option. After enduring pain and tears for however long or short a period of time, history's scales will eventually tilt towards the side that conforms to the development trends of society.